Welcome to the HC Commodities podcast, a podcast dedicated to the commodities sector and the people within it. I'm your host, Paul Chapman. This podcast is produced by HC Group, a global search firm dedicated to the commodities sector. Today we return to the subject of ESG and sustainability. In the wake of COVID, organisations globally made huge commitments and pronouncements around ESG goals. Sustainability teams were hired and grew rapidly. Today we face a global vibe shift in the wake of economic realities and shifting policy. What does that mean for ESG? What does that mean for sustainability? The reality is, in part, it's not going away, but it's certainly more focused on organisational goals and driving customer value. Our guest, who helps clients with just these types of issues, is Anastasia Kuskova. Anastasia is the co-founder and CEO of Sirius, an AI-powered sustainability intelligence organisation focused on the metals and mining value chains. She spent 8 years with the European Resources Group as head of sustainability and transformation, and started her career in strategy consulting. As always, you can really support the show by leaving us a positive review on the platform you're listening on. And as always, I hope you enjoyed the episode. Anastasia, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So I'm looking forward to this discussion. I don't know whether this title will make the final cut, but it's sort of ESG is dead, long live ESG. And that was actually the title of a recent paper that you did. But essentially we're talking about where is ESG today versus sort of the peak of it after COVID, without sort of burying the lead. And what does it mean for organizations today? How crucial is it? What are we seeing going on in the industry? And is it still a crucial facet to being able to participate and operate within key supply chains? And I guess this discussion is going to be more metals focused, but in general, this holds true across the commodities sector. Can you just, before we go any further, can you just get us all on the same definition with regards to environmental, social and governance and the protocols around it? And then we'll dig into kind of what happened post-COVID.
Yeah, so it's actually impossible because ESG is so different for any country and jurisdiction and essentially company. And that's a fundamental problem with sustainability and ESG as a broader subject. And I think what is sustainability for a Saudi company or for a US company or for a European company is different and also different in time. So right now we also see that diversity and inclusion is being completely canceled out and probably won't be part of sustainability efforts of many companies going forward, will be probably somehow backed into HR. So it's very hard to give you a one definition, and I think not really needed. And since sustainability is such a deeply context-based subject, and we really need to look at what's happening in the world right now to provide a proper definition. And I think going back to your question on what happened in the last few years, during COVID or after COVID, when the world needed to, recover, the US, Europe, all of the countries used the growth with green commitments. So IRA, Green Deal, all of the things that came with Green Deal, CBAM, CSRD, also, BlackRock giving those big letters about ESG and sustainability being important for investment, bunch of climate funds, bunch of impact funds, fueled by zero interest rate period, and together with the political landscape, identified sustainability very, very broadly, including a lot of hype subjects, also connected with the things that were happening in the world with BLM and affecting, appearance of all the chief diversity officers, etc. And then now, if we look at what's happening in ESG, again, diversity and inclusion being canceled out completely, Amazon, Meta, Goldman, so all of them canceling their diversity initiatives. BlackRock very slowly, stepping back and backpedaling on their commitments. So sustainability changing every year. And I think right now, when you asked where ESG is right now, in a dark, dark place. So,
Well, let's hold on that, because I want to come back to
yeah.
that. But I think it's worthwhile spending some time on that early period of ESG 1.0.
Mhm.
So, kind of accelerated by COVID, but was there beforehand. And certainly a recognition globally of significant challenges to do with sustainability and the different threads within it. But as you sort of highlighted, governments, policy, and organizations came out with very challenging targets to meet. It was a key driver of investment decisions, both in organizations as well as investment funds, and, was very much front and center. And suddenly any organization that didn't have an ESG policy found itself with the ire of shareholders and employees alike. Can you just spending some time on that period? Because, it was a dramatic shift at the time, and we've obviously going through another dramatic shift we're going to talk about and try and land on where and how organizations should think about ESG today. But what were some of the consequences and reactions of organizations 4 years ago? Because big teams were built, big commitments made. Can you just walk us through, roughly speaking, kind of what the landscape looked like, and then kind of consequences of that was?
Yeah, I remember distinctly that it was a very noticeable shift in just a few months, that it was impossible to hire people, impossible to even book consultants because they were all overbooked, all big four and everything. There was such a hype in early, I would say, 2021, maybe then 2022. I remember that I was building a team back then, a larger team in a large metal producer where I worked before, and it was like through the hiring they received several offers that were twice as much as they asked in the beginning. So it was that difficult to find people. It was also so much demand that and mainly driven by actually by the European policies, because everyone who traded with Europe suddenly realized that they need to comply with things like carbon border adjustment mechanism, right? So CBAM, that for our company as well became a huge incentive to invest in decarbonization of our production and actually start to include carbon pricing into the business case. Because before it was impossible, it was only the goodwill or extra money that you had that you wanted to spend on sustainability. And suddenly that became material, that became relevant and very much sales focused discussion. Also, even in countries like, even in Russia before the war started, they organized an ESG alliance focused on shifting the economy and aligning with European regulation, aligning with the change in Europe, even in Russia, right? So in all of the countries all over the world, it created those waves of putting ESG into CEO agenda. There was a biggest topic at Davos meetings and all of the top level meetings. Yeah, so I think also the commitment, the European commitment, 55% by 2030, it's huge, it's massive, it requires tons of investment. Also, American policies, IRA, even though it's not so directly linked to climate like Green Deal, still it had a massive effect on the industry, and also like the SEC initiative, and that now is dead, or California climate law. So a lot of things happening in the world, and companies building the teams, building the strategies. It became really a bad tone not to have a chief sustainability officer.
Yeah, and it's hard, isn't it? Because we're trying to, there's separating out the policies that drove change, and this is sort of it was a cycle, but also kind of these large commitments made very early on by organizations. And I should say, we're trying to avoid value judgments here, just describing what happened. And some of that comes back to that idea that ESG is somewhat in the eye of the beholder, of these 19 points, whatever it might be, which ones are relevant to your organization. And in some ways, rather than this being bottom-up strategies, they became very top-down ones. And these commitments were made, large investments, as you say, in teams. It was extraordinarily rare to find, high competition for these rare individuals, but also kind of like perhaps a lack of alignment between what you heard, public announcements, and how achievable they were within the organization, and a realism about timelines to achieve those goals, and indeed whether they were actually aligned with, what shareholders expected, right? I mean, it was quite a sort of challenging time now when you look back with hindsight.
Yeah, I think there were a lot of just commitments that were made for the sake of making a loud commitment and making a public announcement that were not really backed by data, by internal analysis. And I personally heard people saying, well, we can commit to 2030 or 2040 net zero by 2030 or 2040 because we won't be there, then we need to comply with it. But now it's just we have to commit to something and then we figure it out. And I think it also, like, the background for this was also because companies just didn't know what they are doing, and that's normal. That's also part of the maturity, right, in the subject area. Sustainability per se is relatively new. ESG is even newer, but sustainability approach, in the today's understanding of sustainability, is really new. You don't really have professionals who have 20 years of experience in sustainability. They can be in environment, they can be in human rights, but not in sustainability. So, and in climate also, we had really, really few specialists who could look at the broader picture and consider the entire organization and think of the net zero approaches and net zero roadmaps. It's a massive exercise, and oftentimes companies were pushed to make those commitments without actually having enough data to support it. And then a few years after, 3, 4, 5 years after, they realized that they cannot actually meet those ambitions. And we also see a lot of companies backpedaling right now on those goals, which I don't think is necessarily bad. There are companies who retract commitments, and I think it's a good thing. And a big example is a poster child, so-called, of sustainability, Unilever, who had a very fancy strategy, very publicized, mentioned in all of the business school case studies. They had a lot of commitments on diversity, on having certain amount of people, I think 5% of their workforce, they wanted to be made up of people with disabilities. They wanted to spend 2 billion annually on diverse businesses worldwide by 2025. Also, I think something with biodegradable, 100% of their ingredients have to be biodegradable by 2030. So, and then early in 2024, they took back some of those commitments because they just realize that they cannot meet them, or it doesn't make sense for the business, and then they get a lot of course, public blaming for that. Let's call it like that. Yeah. So, but I think that's part of the maturity, right? And organizations were pushed to make those commitments without having enough data.
Yeah, and a fair few of we've seen leadership turnover as well, right? Since those days. And let's zooming in on that maturity curve. So we've got the two terminologies going on here. One is ESG and one is sustainability. Mm-hmm. Is that maturity curve about sort of identifying which bits are critical as a result of policy and also as a result of they align with the business's goals? For example, if you're sourcing metals in regions where there's conflict, where there's child labor, that's much more significant and threatening to your business model and shareholder activism than perhaps goals around whatever it might be that's sort of unrelated, if you'd like. Just help us understand that maturity curve. How does, is ESG essentially being sort of stripped down, or is it focusing on one particular area? Is sustainability now sort of that's where that's where the conversations are moving to, and they're identifying which key parts are relevant to the organization. What does that maturity curve look like?
Yeah, so you touched upon several subjects. So first is the materiality, right? So what is important and what is not. And right now in Europe, you also there's a concept of double materiality, so which is now being adopted, I think, by most of the businesses. But essentially, that's about things on that impact your business and that influence as a business and that are relevant for your stakeholders. So you identify those areas and you try to operate sustainably within those areas. But I think what's important in terms of maturity is that among all of the material aspects for you, you identify the ones that where you can have the biggest effect, and the biggest positive effect and the biggest negative effect. And you minimize the negative effect, and you, of course, try to maximize the positive effect within your limits of your business strategy and trying to align with your revenues. It sounds very, very consulting, like what I just said, but increase revenues, decrease costs. But the idea behind is that for example, taking back the Unilever example, they actually improved on their climate goals because they realized that it affects their business much more with crops, with droughts and so on, that the adaptation and decarbonization are much more relevant for their business. And then they looked at the things that are not really so relevant or not really influencing their revenues, their bottom line, or limiting their efficiency and productivity, and they cut them down. So I think that's the approach, that's the very clear path to maturity, where you identify targeted initiatives that actually are in line or aligned with your revenue targets, with your customer demands, with your stakeholder demands, and you push on those, disregarding other things. And that's also a very hard thing to do, because dropping, for example, a goal of 5% of workforce, like made up of people with disabilities, is a very hard thing to do, because you cannot say it's not important, right? And that's also it's with then you look at your materiality matrix, it's also very hard to say that, for example, waste or water is less important than biodiversity for you, right? So these are those areas there you have to be somewhat ruthless. And I think in the beginning of like in early 2020s, right, how you call that, we were not mature enough to be able to make those decisions, right, and communicate them effectively. And with all of the loud announcements and public statements, it was very hard to make those difficult choices. And now companies have to do that because they have.
And they have the data as
Yes.
well, right?
Yes.
Which we'll come on to. Just before we sort of lean in now in that sort of double materiality a bit more, that's sort of fascinating. Can you, because obviously, you've been sort of front and center of this maturity curve, and, this sort of vibe shift, this, ESG moving into a dark place, it must have had profound morale effects on all those teams that were hired and on extraordinary salaries and so forth, and these big pronouncements. And then really, and this was occurring obviously the vibe shift and change of US administration and so forth. But, can you just give us some sense of kind of how those teams have all been impacted across all of these corporates and in consulting? And, is it now a sort of a challenging place to find a role? Can you just I guess, the human impact?
First of all, I think that ESG and sustainability in general attracted many more people in the last few years. And I think personally that best sustainability teams are made up of people with different backgrounds and different expertise. So people coming from marketing, people coming from more STEM background, people coming from strategy. And these are the strongest teams, or from legal, legal is super important, right? Legal and compliance. So a lot of people shifted there. And in general, in many occasions, people start, on LinkedIn, you see that people make fun of, sustainability officers that came out from marketing or PR, etc. But I think that's completely normal with such a new space, and you learn a lot in the job. And throughout those years, people working in those teams, they learned a lot because, again, we started, in many occasions, you started from scratch. You had nothing. In the mining and metal industry, it was different. You had to combine all of the things that were done before because sustainability was always something that you had to worry about, but just in different areas, in the environment, also in communities, in human rights and other areas. So we just needed to combine it. So it was a bit easier for us. But in some companies, you had to build everything from scratch. So it's an amazing experience. In terms of consulting firms, they built enormous teams, and also I think really improved the knowledge base and quality of staff. So it's really cool to hire now people. So you with background in PwC or KPMG, etc. So they have like this foundation and the basic, because you cannot get that in the university, this real experience that you got in those years in consulting. But at the same time, we also see that most of those consulting firms had massive cuts in the last years. Also effect of AI, also effect of companies really building teams internally. Still, last year, the size of teams grew significantly. I think in November we posted a report that analyzed over 1,000 of organizations, and they looked into the way they approach sustainability, and they started hiring less consultants and actually building expertise internally. It's also a big sign of maturity. You understand that actually you need more expertise internally because sustainability is not going away. You cannot just constantly live on consultants. And then those teams are very different. So they are combined from experts from different fields, and usually more senior than junior. And right now, I think, speaking of morale, I think right now, January and February are very tough months for sustainability teams. I try to brighten the mood with all of the memes that I'm posting as a meme lord of sustainability. But really, it's a minefield. Every day, I think right now, every sustainability manager or person working in sustainability just wants to stay under a rock for a few months to see how things will pan out. Because, ESG right now is in a very interesting space. But I think in the long term, or like even in the medium term, there are no signs that something is going to change in the sense of importance of that subject.
Yeah.
It's still going to be important.
The energy and resources sector is experiencing unprecedented change. To help companies navigate this world and capture its opportunities, HC Group launched Enco Insights in 2023. Enco has rapidly become the leading global expert network dedicated to energy and resources. Enco Insights leverages HC Group's 20 years of connections and dedication to the sector to give clients the expertise they need to take decisions fast. Connect with Enco's experts for anything from a 1-hour insight call to a longer-term consulting project at encoinsights.com.
And again, it's that maturity curve, right? And I think that we've certainly seen it, the changing expectations around people in sustainability. Often now they're very senior people from the business. And, there are, and this is where sort of, I guess, where we are today, right? Which is there's lots of policies still out there on the books, and they'll remain, that you have to, that can prohibit you from doing business, or have, for example, CBAM coming along, etc. There are the demands remaining from OEMs, albeit somewhat scaled down and now more aligned with their business goals. But you are plugged in with both the OEMs as well as the commodities sector, and you have to be able to prepare yourself So you are required to disclose where the nature of your commodities are coming from, etc. It's all their attributes around sustainability, that OEM is seeking as well. And again, if you can't, you're precluded from being able to participate in that supply chain. So it has matured, and we've seen that, but actually that means it's no less important, right? I mean, that's sort of where we're ending up in this conversation, is that it's still crucial, meaning whether you can do business, and if you can do business, can you be competitive? Can you give us some sense of kind of where we are today, both from kind of that political strut as well as from the requests and demands from participants in the supply chain?
I think with the maturity, the way we look at sustainability also changes. First, speaking of the political background right now, with the how we call it, the Trump effect, exiting Paris Agreement, canceling diversity and inclusion initiatives within the federal government, and also companies, large American companies following with the cancellation of the programs, and so on. We also see that the Mario Draghi report at the end of last year, and that is now reflected in Europe, actually implementing this or promising to implement this omnibus approach on simplification of requirements even before they were actually implemented. That creates much more chaos, and I'm happy to tell you more about this. This is my favorite subject, on actually stupidity of some of the regulations. But in general, right now, there are a lot of backpedaling and a lot of chaos. I think that general perception of, a side observer would be, oh, ESG is dead. It is actually not, not at all. It's just transforming in a much more sensible format, and it needs to make sense. Today, if you want sustainability initiatives or ESG initiatives or whatever, let's use them interchangeably. They, of course, not are the same things, but it's just for simplification reasons. They have to make sense for the business. And I think that's absolutely normal, because you work on, let's take HR. All of the HR initiatives that you have internally, whatever you do with training and culture and so on, they have to make sense for the business. So it has to be the same for sustainability. And the entire notion that sustainability is just good business without actually bringing money is nonsensical, because money is a universal proxy. And if you want the business to deliver value, if your initiatives actually deliver value to the business, they have to bring money. Maybe this means money in the long term. Maybe that means that we need to calculate externalities somehow, and carbon pricing is one of the ways to do that. But one way or another, they have to bring money, and we're getting there. Because before, where a lot of money was wasted on sustainability was areas for things that are done for branding, for hype, just because it's expected that we do this. Let's do this because it doesn't cost much money. We have some extra. Let's do this. This is stupid. And this dilutes your focus. That dilutes also the perception of company maturity in understanding what is material for them and what's not. And it dilutes the entire notion of sustainability, in my view. But I'm, of course, a very cynical sustainability person with financial background. So for me, it's always important to show the money. And I think we are getting into the era of where sustainability needs to show money. And yeah, so speaking of this maturity curve, we are stepping away from big promises, unsubstantiated, without substance of data and need and business need. And we're going more towards targeted, revenue-focused, customer-focused initiatives that really bring value and hence money.
Well, and I think, I have a friend and university professor of mine in my ear, very much focused on customers and actually what drives value for your customers. And I guess that's the point, right? So in the HC Group context, diversity is really important to us because we've got 8 offices around the world, and not everyone is going to like me, but you build up a diverse group of individuals that represent the countries you're in and different styles and personalities. That gives you far more coverage and likelihood that you're going to be better able to service your clients. And that's the key point, right? And
of course,
you can still generate a competitive advantage if you are supplying what the OEMs are looking for from a sustainability standpoint. Now, they've narrowed down what that means to them, but you are still going to not be able to participate in a contract if your metal, for example, comes from a source that doesn't meet their requirements. Can you just, in practice, how that actually, how that impacts?
Yeah, so I think value chain concerns, especially for the metal and mining industry, for commodities in general, right now are the key. Also, recently MSCI, I think, published a report that social concerns are the biggest ones in investor perspective as well. I think they've been long overshadowed by climate concerns, but now gaining again the prominence. So in OEMs, if many OEMs decided not to source from conflict-affected and high-risk areas several years ago, then soon enough they realized that they can actually meet their demand if they don't do that. So they established very stringent policies on how they're sourcing, where they're sourcing. They run audits on the companies, and if companies do not allow audits on their mines, or if they do not provide enough data, they are risking to lose those long-term contracts. And I think there is no question for anyone in the business that value chain transparency to a degree, right? Transparency in the sense of sharing data where you source from, and like the sustainability parameters of where you source from, not the exact amounts, not the commercial terms of the sourcing, etc. Reasonable level of transparency is necessary for running, for doing a business. We were just discussing before we started recording the Mining in Dabo conference. There were half a day devoted specifically to transparency in the value chains, and with London Metal Exchange, with RMI, Trafigura, China Moly, etc., discussing how they demonstrate that to OEMs and to their customers along the value chain, not even direct customers, but customers of their customers, or customers of their customers of their customers, because that's critical. And that's not going away despite whatever is happening in the political world, because you don't want to have unwanted material with some human rights concerns in your electric car.
Yeah. And this will come into Sirius and what you do in a moment, but also the administrative burdens of meeting the disclosures is high as well, right? So again, it's, long live ESG. You still got to have these teams in place and the processes to be able to A, not do those actions that would preclude you from participating in a supply chain, but B, capturing all that information. You shared a story when we met in Saudi about, I think from a particular car manufacturer, you've got a 90-page PDF to fill out. Can you just help us?
Yeah, so that's, I think that's a lot of personal frustrations went into the story. So the thing with metal and mining value chains is that you're in the beginning of hundreds or thousands of the value chains you supply to construction companies, to electric vehicle producers, OEMs, etc. And essentially for you, that means that you have to share your sustainability data with your customers, customers of your customers, customers of your customers of your customers, with investors, banks, governments, etc. And the overarching notion that there will be one amazing standard and we all will be freed from all of this administrative burden on responding to ESG requests is dead, because CSRD demonstrated that, their first CSRD reports are published, and it's very clear that they are not in any way aligned and not in many not really comparable, and that you can't really use CSRD as a framework that will replace all of those questionnaires, unfortunately. But to me, it was obvious, and I think there is another school of thought that it's impossible to actually standardize sustainability in a way that will replace questionnaires, or let's not call it questionnaires, let's call it tailored requests for data from your customers and your stakeholders. So the way I think the industry is going, or the world is going, is in realizing that sustainability is highly contextual, right? So going back to your question, how do we define sustainability? Let's not try to. And sustainability being highly contextual means that it massively depends on where you operate, what exactly you do, what type of question you are being asked to. And right now, it has to all go through the head of sustainability manager when you receive 90 pages PDF file from a very large OEM to whom you don't even source directly. So you first try to identify which metal actually goes into their factories. And then you, when you figure it out, you spend several days on responding to this questionnaire, manually, of course. And that repeats every day. So I spoke to some of the steel producers who say we have 4 FTEs working just on responding to questionnaires. Because in the steel industry as well, there is huge focus on decarbonization right now. So a lot of questions about carbon footprint, about recycling content, and so on. So it's a huge problem. And the problem that, in my view, cannot be solved by creating another standard. And this administrative burden is something where I think where a lot of sustainability initiatives die, because that's the priority right now. You just need to respond to questionnaires, you need to build reports, CSRD reports, and that's it. There is countless number of sustainability officers that I talked to that said, we don't do anything but CSRD right now. And now, after they've spent years, okay, let's say a year or like months on preparing for CSRD, European Commission suddenly decides that maybe we will simplify the rules. Okay, that's actually much needed, but it's also very hard to orient, and why ESG is in such a dark place right now, because you don't really understand how you can communicate to the management. Do we do CSRD? Are we even in scope? So a lot of companies, a lot of trading companies right now, right, who would be in scope because they have huge revenues, but probably will not be in scope in the next few months if the omnibus suggestions that were leaked would be followed through, because they don't have enough people there. So they would qualify as medium-sized companies and they would not fall into this. So we have several clients who are in this space, not really knowing whether they will be in scope or not. And that's enormous amount of effort and money that they spend in preparing for CSRD. And now they're like in limbo, not really understanding what's going to happen. So that's bad business. But that's just sharing a little bit of what's happening in the industry and how people are confused. But yeah, so essentially that's a huge administrative burden. And the only way for sustainability teams before to solve it was to hire more people, and usually hire junior people, right? Because who would want to respond to questionnaires? But those are actually questionnaires that go to your customers. So you lose tons of value, tons of information on what is important for them. And you can learn where you can actually get green premiums for your product if you look very deeply into those questionnaires, if you understand what your customers are asking about and what actually links to their strategy. And going back to sustainability becoming more revenue driven, I think this is the core. This is the key to understand what is relevant to your customers, link it to the revenue, and build products that would be sustainable but would actually bring money, because somebody has to pay for sustainability. And it's unreasonable to expect that you as a company, because you're a big company, you're just going to do that just because just because, right?
Yeah.
That's the way to transform this administrative burden into something meaningful, I think.
Yeah, an economic opportunity, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
guess that is where the business you founded and built is focused, and why you're in front of all these producers as well, traders as well as OEMs. Can you just give us some sense of what does Sirius do, and how does it unlock that really valuable customer driver set that you get from these questionnaires, but also minimize that, just having 10 poor interns, doing data entry to meet the requirements?
Yeah, and especially now because sustainability budgets are also being cut, so you can't really hire 10 interns anymore. But in general, again, going back to the sustainability being highly contextual, we are following the school of thought that you have to deliver data in whatever format is relevant to your stakeholder. You just have to. You just need to figure out the way to do that cheaply. And we essentially build a universal adapter that transforms your data in whatever way is relevant to your stakeholder and does that quickly, cheaply, and aligned with your strategy and your marketing vision, and giving you all of the details on a granular level on what your stakeholders actually want from you. So with all of the questionnaires running through our engine and all of the reports, you can easily identify gaps, identify opportunities. One of our clients built a green line of ferrochromium based on the data that they got from the use of the system for the last 12 months, because they realized that there is a huge demand from the steel producers on that product. And that's also essential for survival of sustainability teams right now. And I think something that was lacking for a long time is this bridge between sales and sustainability. And being very, very practical. So when I worked in an organization where it was critical to always demonstrate the business case. So nothing was done just because it's good business. Everything was done because it was a good business case. So for me, it was always show me the money. And what we're trying to do with Sirius, we're trying to help sustainability teams and sales teams to show the money in sustainable initiatives in the ways to get the green premium. And we use AI to improve efficiency so that sustainability teams are not focusing on actually looking for data in the documents, finding it and reading for the 25th time a questionnaire and responding to the same thing over and over again. So yeah, simplifying and making it faster, cutting 70% of time spent.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, it's a good summation of kind of where ESG is today. It's still, or sustainability, it is still crucial, because obviously there's policies that you have to follow. There's policy volatility there, so you need to make yourself robust against that. But also, actually, it fundamentally comes down to, as it matures, there's still customer drivers that you have to meet. And actually, how do you meet those economically, leveraging new tools like AI that obviously you're implementing with Sirius, but also capturing that opportunity of understanding your customers' drivers to drive a competitive advantage as well. So I think, I guess if we look forward, we're still going to see chief sustainability officers at every significant organization, but they're going to be much more tied to and focused on, as you say, making the right business case and driving value for their organization and their customers.
Yeah, and I think they will be much more connected to finance and sales function. And if there is one thing that I would think is critical for sustainability teams, is to really understand what is important for sales and for finance stakeholders within their organization, so that they can become their champions and they can build together. Because otherwise, ultimately, they are facing a lot of challenges from executive committee, from C-level executives, on whether sustainability makes sense. So they need to demonstrate the business case, and they need to demonstrate the need on their top level, and a very clear link to the bottom line.
Perfect. Well, it's been a real pleasure to have you on, Anastasia, and hopefully we can have you back on in a couple of years and see where this journey is. I'll put links to Sirius in the show notes for people to go check out your organisation and follow you on LinkedIn as the meme lord of sustainability. And thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. To find out more about HC Group, our global offices, and our expertise in search within the commodities sector, please visit www.hcgroup.global.